Born in Brooklyn to Italian immigrant parents, Alphonse Capone married May Coughlin, and family ties eased his move to Chicago with Johnny Torrio in the early 1920s. Capone rose within the outfit through relationships with political intermediaries and labor figures, balancing domestic life with growing control of rackets. During Prohibition, he directed bootlegging, gambling, and protection across Chicago and nearby suburbs, using bribery and targeted violence to secure territory. The St. Valentine's Day killings in February 1929 intensified national scrutiny. Federal prosecutors pursued taxes when local cases faltered, avoiding corrupted courts and reluctant witnesses. In October 1931, he was convicted of federal tax evasion and received a long sentence, serving in Atlanta and then Alcatraz. Illness advanced in custody, diminishing his influence as associates took practical control. After release, he retired to Palm Island, Florida, severely impaired by neurosyphilis. Capone died in Florida in January 1947 after pneumonia and a stroke. He was first interred at Mount Olivet Cemetery, then reinterred at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, beside family. The comparatively modest stone, amid many outfit burials, frames a legacy defined by public spectacle, yet concluded with ordinary cemetery records and a steady flow of historical visitors. Raised in a large Queens family, John Gotti married Victoria DeGiorgio, and the household remained closely tied to extended relatives and neighborhood networks. Early associations with crews in Ozone Park led to sponsorship within the Gambino family. Gotti cultivated a public style that contrasted with the older generation's preference for discretion, while maintaining loyalty structures through family and long-standing friendships. Gotti's rise followed the murder of Paul Castellano in December 1985, after which he consolidated control of the Gambino family. Media attention, fueled by tailored suits and confident sidewalk interviews, produced the Dapper Don label, then the Teflon Don after a series of acquittals. Federal authorities adapted with coordinated racketeering charges, extensive surveillance, and testimony from Salvatore Gravano. In 1992, a federal jury convicted Gotti under racketeering statutes, ending the string of courtroom successes. Imprisoned at the federal penitentiary in Marion, then at other high-security facilities, Gotti faced strict communication limits and sustained legal pressure on his circle. Cancer emerged in custody, reducing his contact with family and diminishing his physical presence even as his name retained cultural visibility. Internal family disputes over succession unfolded while he remained under intensive confinement, with relatives navigating loyalty, risk, and surveillance. Gotti died in custody in June 2002 from complications of cancer. The family arranged a traditional Catholic funeral with considerable public attention and heavy police presence. He was interred in the Gotti family mausoleum at St. John Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, alongside relatives and eventually other family figures. Visitors continue to mark the site, which sits among numerous graves of New York crime figures. The contrast between televised charisma and a secure mausoleum setting highlights the divide between media image and the institutional outcomes of federal prosecution. The burial within a family structure, rather than a solitary plot, underscores the enduring role of kinship in the Gambino world, even after the legal dismantling of Gotti's leadership. Born in Ohio to a young, unstable household, Charles Manson spent much of his early life in institutions, forming transient ties that shaped his later influence. After release from federal custody in the late 1960s, Manson drew followers in California, forming a close-knit group around music industry contacts and communal living. Relationships within the group, including young women who adopted new identities, reinforced his authority through isolation and shared routines. Manson's notoriety stemmed from directing followers in a series of murders in Los Angeles in August 1969. The crimes, prosecuted in a high-profile trial, placed Manson and several adherents at the center of a national reckoning with cult dynamics and manipulation. Convictions followed, and death sentences were later commuted to life terms after the state changed its capital punishment framework in the early 1970s. Manson's public image became a persistent media subject, often overshadowing the more complex histories of his followers and victims. He remained in California prisons for decades, repeatedly denied parole. Health declined with age, and by the mid-2000s he moved through medical units under close supervision. The state maintained tight restrictions on interviews and correspondence, reflecting ongoing interest from the public and concerns about influence over remaining followers. Manson died in California in November 2017 from complications related to natural causes. A court-supervised dispute over his remains followed, with competing claims from purported kin and associates. Authorities ultimately released the body for cremation after settling legal questions of next of kin and disposition. His ashes were scattered, leaving no conventional grave or headstone. The absence of a marked burial site, contrasted with the enduring archive of trial documents and parole records, reflects the state's management of his legacy, which centers on legal outcomes and institutional records rather than a physical memorial. Raised in Texas, Bonnie Parker married young, kept ties to her mother and siblings, and later formed a close partnership with Clyde Barrow that intertwined romance, loyalty, and shared flight. Family visits and roadside meetings sustained contact during periods of hiding, while companions in the Barrow circle provided support and transportation across rural routes. Parker and Barrow robbed small banks, stores, and filling stations during the early 1930s, generating headlines that mixed notoriety with Depression-era curiosity. Photographs recovered from a Missouri hideout showing Parker with a cigar and a pistol fueled a public image that exceeded the scale of their takings. Law enforcement coordination increased as killings during encounters hardened resolve across state lines. Decline set in as injuries, constant travel and surveillance narrowed options. Texas and Louisiana officers, working from informant leads, staged an ambush along a rural road near Gibbsland in May 1934. The volley killed both occupants instantly, ending the pair's flight and closing pending cases across multiple jurisdictions. Parker's funeral drew large crowds in Dallas, where strong family ties guided arrangements. She was buried at Crown Hill Memorial Park in Dallas, later moved within the cemetery to a different plot at family request. Despite public fascination with the duo, Parker was not buried alongside Barrow, reflecting decisions shaped by relatives and the practicalities of cemetery planning. The separation in burial and the ordinary cemetery setting temper the sensational imagery of the period. What endures most reliably are arrest records, coroner reports, and a gravesite that receives steady visitors under routine cemetery rules, rather than any folklore of outlaw reunion. Born to a Texas sharecropping family, Clyde Chestnut Barrow remained closely linked to parents and siblings through frequent moves and seasonal work. He met Bonnie Parker in Dallas, and the relationship quickly merged with his ties to Brother Buck and other associates, creating a small circle that shared cars, hideouts, and responsibilities. Family visits and safe houses offered temporary relief but also exposed patterns that investigators later tracked. Barrow led a series of robberies of small banks, stores, and gas stations during the early 1930s, favoring quick strikes and backroads. Killings during confrontations with law officers escalated efforts to stop the group, prompting coordination across Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Louisiana. Public attention grew after photographs surfaced from a Missouri apartment, which amplified the couple's image beyond the limited proceeds of their crimes. Wounds, constant evasion, and the arrest or death of companions weakened the group. In May 1934, Texas and Louisiana officers acted on informant leads to arrange an ambush near Gibbsland, Louisiana. The officers fired on the Ford as it approached, killing Barrow and Parker instantly, and ending a multi-state pursuit that had strained local departments and federal cooperation. Barrow's family claimed the body and organized a Dallas funeral attended by large crowds. He was buried at Western Heights Cemetery in Dallas within a family plot that includes other Barrow relatives. Despite the couple's close partnership, he was not interred with Parker, reflecting family decisions and cemetery arrangements made under pressure of public attention. Barrow's grave anchors the historical record to a specific place within Dallas, connecting headlines and arrest files to a modest stone. The physical separation from Parker's burial, common in family-guided arrangements, underscores how the legal and domestic worlds reasserted control after the spectacle of the Barrow chase. Born in Brooklyn to immigrant parents, Benjamin Siegel formed early partnerships with neighborhood associates, most notably Meyer Lansky, and later married Esta Krakauer, with whom he had 2 daughters. Ties to East Coast syndicate figures shaped his movements between New York and California, where friendships with Hollywood contacts mixed with obligations to older partners. Siegel balanced family life in Los Angeles with travel and meetings that linked him to national operations. Siegel's public legacy centers on his role in developing the Flamingo Project near Las Vegas in the mid-1940s. Backed by syndicate capital, he oversaw construction and operations that ran over budget and behind schedule, drawing internal criticism. The opening failed to meet expectations, and the property temporarily closed for adjustments, then resumed operations as post-war travel expanded. Siegel maintained a high-profile lifestyle, which contrasted with the demands of his investors and the scrutiny of law enforcement. Pressure increased as cost overruns, delays, and security concerns eroded confidence among financiers. In June 1947, gunmen shot Siegel through the window of a Beverly Hills home where he often stayed, killing him instantly. The killing ended his direct influence over the Flamingo, which soon stabilized under different management and became a template for later strip development. Funeral arrangements reflected his enduring New York ties. Siegel was buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, where a modest marker notes his given name and dates in a family plot. The grave sits within a cemetery that includes many figures from entertainment and public life, aligning his final resting place with the city where he spent his last years. The site's modest scale, compared to the later prominence of the Las Vegas Strip, illustrates a familiar historical contrast, a grand civic legacy built by many hands beside a simple stone. Archival records, corporate files, and property ledgers frame Siegel's role within a broader post-war transformation rather than a solitary founding act. Born in South Boston to a working-class family, James Whitey Bulger kept close ties to siblings, including William, who later held prominent public office in Massachusetts. Long-standing neighborhood. Relationships supported Bulger's early criminal activity and eventual leadership within the Winter Hill Gang. He maintained a domestic partnership with Catherine Gregg, whose loyalty and practical support would shape years on the run. Bulger controlled loan sharking, extortion, and narcotics distribution while cultivating informant relationships with federal agents. Those contacts, later exposed, sparked deep controversy over compromised investigations and selective targeting of rivals. As indictments neared in the mid-1990s, advance warning enabled Bulger to flee Boston, beginning a long period as a fugitive that drew national attention. For more than a decade, Bulger and Gregg evaded capture by living quietly under assumed names, first moving across the country, then settling in a Santa Monica apartment. A public service announcement campaign focused on Gregg's routines led to tips and arrest in 2011. Federal trials in Boston produced convictions for racketeering and multiple murders, with testimony from former associates and relatives of victims shaping the record. Bulger entered federal custody for life, moving through high-security facilities under tight restrictions. In October 2018, shortly after transfer to a West Virginia penitentiary, inmates assaulted and killed him. The incident prompted investigations into transfer decisions and placement practices for high-profile prisoners. Family arranged burial at St. Joseph Cemetery in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, within a family plot. The grave is plain and unpublicized, consistent with cemetery rules and efforts to limit spectacle. The contrast between years of intense public scrutiny and a subdued burial reflects the institutional emphasis on security and privacy at the end of a highly public career in organized crime. Raised in Indianapolis, John Herbert Dillinger stayed connected to his father and stepmother even after youthful troubles led to prison time. Upon release during the early 1930s, Dillinger rejoined associates linked through Midwestern families and farm country safehouses. Relationships with Anna Sage and other contacts later played roles in surveillance and capture efforts. Dillinger became a central figure of Depression-era banditry, robbing Midwestern banks and occasionally small-town institutions while fleeing across state lines. Armed escapes from local jails and a widely publicized jailbreak in Crown Point, Indiana, fed his public image. Federal authorities, newly empowered under expanded jurisdiction, coordinated with local police to pursue him, turning the chase into a national test of interagency cooperation. By mid-1934, informant leads narrowed his movements in Chicago. On a July evening, agents and Chicago police waited outside the Biograph Theater as Dillinger left a film screening with companions. Officers closed in and fired, killing him at the curb, ending a manhunt that had symbolized shifting federal tactics during the era. His body returned to Indianapolis, where family arranged a funeral with large crowds and heavy police presence. Dillinger was buried at Crown Hill Cemetery, Indianapolis, in a family plot. The grave reportedly received protective measures, including extra concrete and metal, to deter souvenir seekers and grave tampering. Cemetery management enforces rules to limit disturbances around the site. The grave's enduring attention, set against the limited proceeds of many robberies, illustrates the gap between notoriety and material legacy. Archival case files, court documents, and burial records provide the most stable account of Dillinger's life and death, grounding a turbulent story in a precise place and date. Born in Memphis and raised in Mississippi and Tennessee, George Kelly Barnes married Catherine Thorne, whose ambition and contacts encouraged a shift from small bootlegging to higher-stakes crimes. The couple cultivated an image built around a Thompson submachine gun, reinforcing a reputation that outpaced early deeds. Family ties, including stepchildren in the household, intertwined with the pair's travels and criminal planning. Kelly's notoriety rests on the 1933 kidnapping of oilman Charles Urgel in Oklahoma City. The victim's careful observations, including ambient sounds and timing clues, aided federal investigators and set a standard for modern kidnapping inquiries. Swift arrests followed in multiple states, and federal charges, strengthened by interstate elements, led to convictions for Kelly, Catherine, and associates. The case affirmed federal jurisdiction over kidnapping, aligning with evolving bureau practices during the early 1930s. Kelly served long terms in federal custody, moving between institutions that included Alcatraz and Leavenworth. He adapted to routine, worked assigned jobs, and saw occasional family contact decline as years passed. Accounts from guards and fellow inmates depict a compliant prisoner whose earlier bravado faded within institutional order. He died in July 1954 at Leavenworth from a heart ailment. Authorities notified relatives and arrangements proceeded with little publicity. Kelly was buried at Cottondale Cemetery near Paradise, Texas, under his birth name, with a modest marker. The site receives occasional visitors but remains quiet compared to more famous outlaw graves. The plain grave and steady prison record contrast with the theatrical nickname that defined his press image. Court transcripts, Urschel's testimony, and federal files sustain the historical account more than legend, anchoring Kelly's story in documented procedures and a small cemetery in North Texas. Born in Calabria, Umberto Anastasio settled in Brooklyn with siblings, including Anthony, whose union position on the docks shaped later influence. Albert married Elsa Barnesi, and the household moved among Brooklyn addresses while family and Calabrian contacts anchored trust. Partnerships with future bosses and labor racketeers formed through stevedore work, card rooms, and protection crews. Anastasia's reputation grew as an enforcer aligned with waterfront rackets and with associates who later became known as Murder Incorporated. Ties to Vincent Mangano's family, followed by shifts during the Castellammarise realignment, positioned him as a decisive figure in resolving disputes through intimidation and targeted killings. After Vincent Mangano disappeared in the early 1950s and Philip Mangano was found dead, Anastasia consolidated control with Frank Costello's support. He gained the formal role of boss, with Carlo Gambino as underboss, while his brother Anthony maintained influence through the Longshoremen's Union. Legal pressure mounted through state investigations into labor extortion, gambling, and homicides linked by informants. Rivalries converged around Anastasia's volatile style and exposure to witnesses. In October 1957, while seated in the barber chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, gunmen entered and shot him repeatedly. The attack ended his tenure immediately and accelerated a leadership shift toward Gambino. Funeral services in Brooklyn drew heavy police presence and careful crowd control. Initial interment was reported at Greenwood Cemetery, reflecting family considerations and proximity to relatives. He was later placed in a crypt at St. John Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, a site that includes many New York organized crime figures. The mausoleum setting limits public contact, consistent with cemetery policies for high-profile interments. The sequence from dockside enforcement to a hotel barbershop killing has become a case study in how internal governance, labor leverage, and prosecutorial pressure can converge. The final placement among other New York figures underscores the dense landscape of mafia memorials in Queens, where organizational history intersects with family-led burial decisions. Born in the Russian Empire and raised on Manhattan's Lower East Side, Meyer Lansky formed early bonds with Benjamin Siegel and other neighborhood friends who later became national syndicate partners. Lansky married Anne Citron, raised children, and kept close ties to extended family, balancing domestic routines with discreet business travel. Lifelong friendships, especially with Charles Luciano, anchored trust as informal governance replaced street fighting with negotiation. Lansky's public significance lies in financial organization. He helped coordinate multi-city gambling operations, bookmaking, and distribution of profits, emphasizing reliable accounting and conflict resolution. In the late 1930s and 1940s, he worked on Havana ventures and racetrack and casino interests, aligning with American and Cuban partners as tourism expanded. Senate inquiries and local probes scrutinized these networks, but Lansky often avoided direct legal exposure through careful distance from daily operations. Legal pressure rose after the war, as state and federal agencies targeted wire services, casinos, and tax liabilities. In the early 1970s, he sought to remain in Israel under the law of return, citing heritage and health. Israeli courts rejected the bid, and he returned to the United States to face tax cases where some charges faltered for evidentiary reasons. By then, his public profile had shifted from feared organizer to aging figure managing illness and family concerns. Lansky died in Miami Beach in January 1983 from natural causes. Funeral arrangements were private, with relatives and longtime associates in attendance. He was buried at Mount Nebo Cemetery in Miami, with a modest headstone reflecting family names and Hebrew inscriptions. The grave attracts quiet visitors, researchers, and occasional media, but the site remains unadorned compared to the scale of stories attached to his name. The restrained memorial underscores how records of ledgers, Senate transcripts, and court filings now define his legacy more than legend. The burial in a local Jewish cemetery near his final residence mirrors a career that prioritized discretion, accounting, and negotiated order over public display. Born in Chicago to Sicilian immigrant parents, Salvatore Muni Giancana married Angeline de Tolve, and the family settled in suburban Oak Park while maintaining ties to relatives and longtime associates. Early work as a driver and enforcer brought him into the outfit's core circle, where relationships with Anthony Accardo and other senior figures shaped his rise. Giancana balanced domestic obligations with extended stays in safe apartments and meeting spots across the city. Giancana oversaw gambling, numbers, and protection rackets, coordinating revenue from Chicago neighborhoods and satellite operations in the Midwest and beyond. Public attention followed reports of connections to entertainment figures and speculation about political contacts, though documentation remains mixed. Law enforcement pressure increased through wiretaps, tax cases, and coordinated federal and state investigations, which strained loyalties and narrowed his options. In the mid-1960s, Giancana left the country for Mexico, then returned under legal pressure and renewed grand jury demands. Disputes within the outfit sharpened, and surveillance documented friction over money and control. On a June night in 1975, while cooking at his Oak Park home, an assailant shot him multiple times, including a final shot to the mouth, in a killing widely viewed as an internal resolution rather than a public message. Funeral arrangements drew significant police presence and controlled access. Giancana was interred at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, within a section that includes many outfit figures. The stone and setting are modest, by design aligning with cemetery rules and the family's preference for privacy. The burial amid other Chicago leaders underscores the continuity of outfit history along the western edge of the city. Archival surveillance logs, tax filings, and court transcripts sustain the record more reliably than rumor, anchoring Giancana's story in the institutions that ultimately constrained his final years. Born in Vermont and raised largely in Washington, Theodore Bundy maintained complicated family relationships that were later reinterpreted in court narratives and media coverage. He dated within college circles, built friendships through political campaigns and volunteer work, and projected a socially adept persona that contrasted sharply with later criminal findings. Those relationships, including former partners and classmates, became sources for timelines and identifications during investigations. Bundy committed murders across several states during the mid-1970s, exploiting mobility, charm, and familiarity with university and civic settings. Arrests in Utah, escape episodes in Colorado, and the final crimes in Florida produced a multi-state record that challenged coordination among agencies. Trials in Florida, particularly the proceedings in Miami and Orlando, brought televised testimony, forensic analysis, and a rare on-camera marriage declaration that underscored his manipulative courtroom tactics. Convicted in Florida and sentenced to death, Bundy spent years on death row at Florida State Prison. Appeals cycles focused on procedural claims and the admissibility of forensic evidence, while interviews yielded partial confessions that added details to known cases. Health remained stable, and prison routines limited his contact to attorneys, investigators, and select visitors. On a January morning in 1989, Florida authorities carried out the execution in the electric chair after final appeals failed. Crowds gathered outside the prison, reflecting intense public attention to the case. Officials released the remains to a designated representative in accordance with state procedures. Bundy was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in a wooded area in Washington, associated with earlier search efforts. No formal gravesite or public memorial exists. The absence of a marked burial location reflects a deliberate effort to avoid creating a site of interest, leaving court records, investigative files, and archived broadcasts as the primary markers of the case. Born in Wisconsin and raised partly in Ohio, Jeffrey Dahmer's family life was marked by relocations and parental separation, with continued contact maintained through visits and letters. As a young adult, he lived alone in Milwaukee apartments, holding short-term jobs and maintaining limited friendships. Neighbors, co-workers, and occasional acquaintances later provided statements that helped assemble timelines. Dahmer's crimes, committed mostly in Milwaukee during the late 1980s and early 1990s, involved the killing of multiple men and boys. Discovery followed a July 1991 escape by a prospective victim who alerted police. A search of Dahmer's apartment uncovered remains, photographs, and tools that established the scope of the case. He was arrested, gave detailed statements, and faced charges that led to convictions in Wisconsin, with additional proceedings in Ohio for an earlier killing. Sentencing in Wisconsin resulted in consecutive life terms. While incarcerated, Dahmer was placed under close supervision, then shifted within the state system as administrators evaluated safety and management. He participated in limited work and counseling programs, and he received occasional visits from family and clergy. Public attention remained high, with ongoing media coverage and legal reviews of police responses in 1991. In November 1994, at Columbia Correctional Institution, another inmate assaulted Dahmer in a supervised work area, causing fatal injuries. Officials announced his death shortly after transport to a nearby hospital. Investigations assessed custody practices and inmate supervision, producing policy adjustments within the state system. Following legal consultation with relatives, the body was cremated. His ashes were divided between his parents, and personal belongings connected to the case were later destroyed or held by authorities to prevent exploitation. There is no public grave or memorial. The official record, preserved in court files, evidence inventories, and custody reviews, constitutes the primary documentation of his life, crimes, and death. Born in Chicago to a working-class family, John Wayne Gacy maintained close ties to his mother and siblings, later marrying twice and presenting a community-minded image. He operated a small contracting business and engaged in civic activities, including local Democratic Party events and charitable appearances. Employees, neighbors, and acquaintances, many drawn from youth employment, became central to later investigations and victim identifications. Police inquiries intensified in the late 1970s after missing person reports connected to Gacy's orbit. A search of his home in Norwood Park Township uncovered evidence linking him to multiple murders, with remains discovered in crawl spaces and nearby disposal sites. Prosecutors assembled a comprehensive case using forensic anthropology, dental records, and testimony from survivors and former employees. Gacy's trial in Illinois concluded with convictions on multiple counts, and the court imposed a death sentence. During years on death row, Gacy pursued appeals and civil actions, granting interviews in which he denied responsibility or blamed accomplices, claims rejected by the courts. He engaged in painting and correspondence while prison staff managed extensive public attention. Families of victims and advocacy groups monitored proceedings, ensuring continued scrutiny of appeal deadlines and clemency petitions. Raised in El Paso within a large family, Ricardo Leyva Muñoz Ramirez spent time with relatives whose experiences and stories influenced his outlook during adolescence. He moved between Texas and California as a young adult, held short-term jobs, and lived in transient arrangements. Relationships were sporadic, and acquaintances later provided limited insights into movements during the mid-1980s. Ramirez committed a series of home invasion assaults and murders in California during 1984 and 1985. Investigators from several jurisdictions coordinated as patterns emerged in methods and stolen items. Identification followed a fingerprint match after a call from the public, and a group of civilians helped restrain Ramirez on a Los Angeles street until police arrived. Trials featured extensive forensic evidence, witness testimony, and a record that spanned multiple crime scenes. Convicted and sentenced to death, Ramirez entered San Quentin State Prison. He remained on death row for decades during appeals that challenged evidentiary rulings and jury management. Health issues surfaced over time, and contact with family and select visitors continued under strict procedures. Public interest persisted through media accounts and occasional court filings, but institutional routines defined his daily life. Ramirez died in June 2013 at a Northern California hospital while still in state custody. The cause was related to complications from lymphoma and associated organ failure. Officials followed standard procedures for notifying next of kin and arranging the disposition of remains. He was cremated, and there is no public gravesite. The absence of a marked memorial reflects corrections policy and family preferences, leaving court transcripts, forensic records, and custody files as the primary documentation of the case and its conclusion. In May 1994, the state of Illinois carried out the execution by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center. Officials released remains to designated relatives following established procedures. Law enforcement and medical authorities retained parts of his brain for research at the request of scientists studying pathology, a decision made within institutional protocols. Gacy was cremated. His ashes were given to family and no public gravesite was established. The absence of a marked burial place reflects deliberate efforts to prevent a physical site from becoming a point of attention. The formal record of the case, including court transcripts, forensic reports, and property inventories, remains the authoritative account.